Bradley Bethel, the research associate here at the Restore Community Coalition. The Community Coalition is a non-for-profit on a mission to remediate a portion of Humboldt Parkway, which was sacrificed by the Kensington Expressway back in the 1960s. And we're reaching out to our neighbors and elected officials to find a long-term solution for this neighborhood. Today, we join here architect Robert Coles, who was among the very first vocal critics against the destruction of Humboldt Parkway. How are you, Mr. Coles?
Well, how are you?
I'm doing great.
Fantastic.
All right, so this is a list of questions that we have here for you, and the very first question we have is, when did you first learn that Humboldt Parkway was set to be destroyed?
I first learned about it when I came to Buffalo as the architect for the John F. Kennedy Recreation Center, and that was in 1960. I should add that I was the architect for the firm that was actually designing the Kensington Expressway, so I had an inside track as to what was going on by looking at the maps that they had developed to indicate where the expressway would go.
What was the name of that firm, if I might ask?
What was that?
What was the name of that firm?
Oh, it was Clinton B.F. Brill. Clinton B. F. Brill. And they were the New York State arm of Duluth Cather, D-E-L-E-U-W, Duluth Cather, who essentially was a national firm.
So were you the only minority in that firm?
I was the only minority in that firm.
Anywhere around, I'm sure, Western New York?
What
The only black architect in Western New York?
well, other than John Brent, but he had been deceased since 1962.
Right.
But there were no other black architects around here.
Understood. What was your relationship with Mr. Brent?
He was a confidant, in that I would talk to him with regard to the profession, and he would advise me.
I noticed that you had been an officer in the National Association of Minority Architects.
Yes, I was.
And so from there you were able to, even though there weren't very many of you here in Western New York, you could broaden your professional relationships through an organization like that?
Well, the Organization of Minority Architects was started in about 1972, and it began in Chicago. And I attended the initial meeting and was one of the founding members of the association and was active in the organization until 1978 and had risen to a vice president when I left the organization.
Awesome.
So on to the next question. What did residents do when they first learned about the new expressway? Were there any public meetings regarding it?
I organized a meeting of the community people to show them what was going to happen to their property sometime in 1961. And the meeting was held in front of in front of my house on Humboldt Parkway, which was being considered for construction at that time. And I showed them how much of the lawn that they would be losing if the expressway went through. Unfortunately, most of the neighbors didn't believe what I was saying, and their response was, that is not what the man downtown told me. And so they didn't really respond until the trees were being cut in the block next to theirs, and they essentially wanted the trees to be retained. And I said, it's too late now.
And that leads to the very next question regarding your home. Why did you decide to build it on Humboldt when people were just discovering what was going on with Humboldt Parkway?
Well, as an architect, my job is to see things as they can be, as opposed to as they are. And I saw that lot at Humboldt as a wonderful place to build a house in the inner city, because I wanted to be in the inner city so that people could know what I as an architect could do, and I as a black architect could do. I also wanted it to be an example of what a black family could do within the black neighborhood, because I had two children who were growing up at the time.
Would you mention some of your neighbors on Humboldt Parkway? Some of the your neighbors who had kids your age, you know, why you thought that would be a good neighborhood?
Yes, well, Hamlin Park was always one of the outstanding neighborhoods in the city, you know, and so I didn't view it as a negative thing to move to Humboldt Parkway, although I was advised by some people that I ought not to do it because the neighborhood was deteriorating and going down. Mm-hmm.
What are some of the families you remember, say your kids playing with their kids?
The Austins, who were on Ferry, or rather, what was it? At Ferry and, no, not Ferry. Oh, I forget the block and all, but the Austin daughter is married to Byron Brown.
Okay,
Yeah.
Harvey Austin.
Yeah, that's right, Harvey Austin, yeah, and the daughter and my daughter used to pal around together, and so they got to know each other. Mm-hmm.
Were there any alternatives proposed instead of an expressway?
No, I think that by the time we learned what was happening, it was too late. The plans were drawn, the reality was there, and it was too late to do anything. I mean, when I say too late, there was this movement, which was the no overhead transit movement, that wanted the trains to run underground all the way out to UB, and they were successful in a certain way in that the transit was along Main Street, but unfortunately it didn't connect to any of the major institutions that poor people would need to know, be connected to. They weren't connected to Sisters Hospital, wasn't connected to ECC. It just went zoomed down Main Street, and that was it.
As an architect, what did you see as the main design flaws and negative impact of an expressway?
Well, the expressway basically took the traffic from the surrounding streets and put them into, you might say, a tunnel that went through the east side of Buffalo. It was a quick way for people in the suburbs to get to the city and back, but in doing so, it provided, it was a major disservice to the community itself.
So that took all the life out of Jefferson and Fillmore.
Well, that was not the only thing that took the life out of Jefferson and Fillmore. I think the loss of the War Memorial Stadium probably did as much harm, in that many businesses were based upon the income that they could receive from the games and the other entertainments that were held at War Memorial Stadium. And because of the lack of business, they themselves went out of business. I mean, in a sense, Jefferson Avenue was devastated, really, and still is, really, if you look at it. I mean, other than the development around Jefferson and Utica, it's still a no man's land.
I've seen a lot of historic photos of Jefferson Avenue. It's a major difference from what it is now.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it used to be a vibrant business street, and unfortunately, because of the lack of business on the street, it's close to a no man's land, really. You have a new mini development going up at Ferry and Jefferson now, you might say, anchored by Gigi's restaurant, but there's also 1490, whatever is left of 1490. I think that that institution has lost a lot of its vitality.
Well, they just received a grant to refurbish that building.
Oh, they did.
Turning it into market rate apartments.
I see.
Community space.
I see.
It's coming back.
It's coming back.
That will be a very special anchor, as you said, to Ferry and Jefferson. Yep, the mayor and Mr. Bellamy did a ribbon cutting probably 2 or 3 months ago.
He had a ribbon setting?
I should say groundbreaking.
I see.
Yes, yes, groundbreaking. So we were happy to see that, and we hope that there will be more investment along Jefferson.
I see.
Avenue, for sure.
Well, let's see, I did the Johnny Wiley Recreation Center at Jefferson and Best, and between Jefferson and Best and the next viable enterprise is the Tops Market and the War Memorial, the Tops Market and the Frank Merriweather Library and that complex, and then it jumps over to Jefferson and Ferry, really. So there are a lot of gaps in there.
There are.
I mean, I grew up in the Maston Laurel neighborhood, so I remember when that was a Jewish marketing area, and all the Jewish enterprises were down that street really at one time, and then the Jewish community fled that area, Jefferson and Utica, and went to Hamlin Park, and then from there to North Buffalo, really. So it was an interesting neighborhood move.
And I'm interested to hear that the shopkeepers were not African American, and were there? Did they welcome African American customers on Jefferson?
I think they welcome African American customers because African Americans almost had no place to go. The one supermarket which was there was the A&P store at Jefferson and Landon, I think, and so forth. But my mother used to shop on Jefferson and so forth, and so they used the street really.
A lot.
A lot.
Talk to us a little bit about Fillmore, because as we think about Humboldt Parkway, and as we ask for the restoration of the 33, the other street that lost a lot of business when the 33 came in was Fillmore.
Yes, it did.
What are your memories of Fillmore?
Well, my memories of Fillmore are a little vague because I didn't use Fillmore as a shopping street or as a recreational site or anything. And so I don't, all I know is that Fillmore paralleled Jefferson, and it appeared that its ills were common to both of the streets, Jefferson and Fillmore, really.
No doubt.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about before the expressway? And as a child, did you play on Humboldt Parkway? Did you ride horses there? I mean, what is your recollection?
Oh, well, I mean, I built my house in 1960, and so I had about 4 years of the expressway before the trees came down. And so my children used to play in the medium of Humboldt Parkway. And even though they had signs up that said no ball playing, that, of course, was ignored by most of us, really. And my friend, Dr. George Blackman, lived across the street from me. And so at cocktail time every day, we would cross the median to have cocktails. And that was only like a 50-yard walk. Now, if I went to see him, if he were living, I'd have to travel 1.5 miles to get to see him because of the traffic pattern.
You'd probably have to go down to Utica. Where would you cross?
Across at Delvin.
Cross at Delaware.
Yeah, I'd have to cross at Delvin and then up immediately off of the expressway and then circle around down to Kensington and then over.
What an inconvenience.
Yeah, what an inconvenience. Well, fortunately, our friendship was strong enough, or the martinis were strong enough, so that we stayed together. Yeah.
Well, this does bring me to a very crucial question that goes into my current research about a particularly interesting neighborhood called the Trinidad Neighborhood Association. Do you have any particular recollections of this particular neighborhood?
Well, the Trinidad neighborhood is directly across the expressway from the Hamlin Park neighborhood. It probably suffered more in terms of being cut off by the expressway than Hamlin Park, because I don't know how strong the neighborhood organization was and whether it was able to handle the turmoil that was created, really. I see that as an example of what should never have happened, really. But fortunately, we had in Hamlin Park Charles Perkins, who started the neighborhood organization, and he was strong enough to make the city recognize that it had to do certain things to keep that neighborhood vital. Did you know Charles Perkins?
I believe Mr. Clifford Bell mentioned that in an interview that I had with him just yesterday.
Oh, I see. Yeah, Charles Perkins was
Are there any local or state philanthropists that you would recommend for the Restore Community Coalition? To elaborate, we're looking for philanthropists who can help with our fundraising and promotional efforts to spread the word about restoring Humboldt Parkway in accordance to similar challenges that we're facing in other cities.
Well, the biggest philanthropist, I would say, is the state of New York, because they've got all the money. Really. And look at the state of New York, or the federal government, because they had responsibility for funding the expressway, or part of the responsibility. I don't see any local entrepreneurs able to tackle that job, because that job is a huge job. In fact, I don't know if it will ever be built, because you're talking about like $500,000. I mean, a $500 million to do it, really. It's no mean feat to develop what they're proposing to develop, which is to cover that expressway to Delvin to Best Street, I think it is, really. And that's going to be very difficult.
Well, just to give you a few examples of how this was tackled in other cities, Phoenix had Interstate 10 cut through a portion of downtown, which was since covered by Margaret Hance Park in the early 90s, which covers about 32 acres and costs what would now be about $142 million. And Dallas had a portion of Spur 366 cutting through downtown, which was covered as recently as 2012 of 5 acres of Clyde Warren Park for what would now be $110 million. And those were done through funding for their respective state departments of transportations and public funding, as well as philanthropist effort in the Dallas initiative.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't know about those initiatives, but if they can do it, maybe it could be done in Buffalo as well.
Those are just two of about 24 case studies that we had been looking at. What was
So Dallas, and the case studies you're looking at are Dallas is one?
That's the Clyde Warren Park in Dallas, Texas.
I see.
And the Margaret T. Hance Park in Phoenix, Arizona.
Right. But you mentioned something like 5 acres? One was a 5 acre?
The Clyde Warren Park was 5 acres.
Yeah, well, you're talking about a lot more than 5 acres at Humboldt Parkway, right?
Our estimate of Humboldt Parkway would cover about 14 and a half acres.
Yeah, that is correct.
So what was your involvement with the renovations of Headley Place?
I was the design architect for Headley Place and did the initial preliminary design on the project.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Hamlin Park Taxpayers Association? You were probably a leader in that organization. Was your design work for them or for the city?
Well, I was not a member of the Hamlin Park Taxpayers Association. My wife was. Yeah. So she was involved in the details of the organization beyond the 60 Headley Place, really. I was only involved as the architect. Well, let's see. I was involved in 2 instances. One is that we did a historic preservation study in 1990 for Hamlin Park, and we looked at almost 1,500 residences and evaluated them, and so we did that study, and then we were asked to come in and do the initial building restoration for 60 Headley Place. Mm-hmm.
Understood. And how important do you think the Taxpayers Association was to maintaining neighborhood pride and having the neighbors to have a united front when issues came from the city or the state?
I think the Hamlin Park Association was very effective in terms of letting Canisius College know how important it was to keep Hamlin Park as it was, not only for Hamlin Park, but for Canisius College. Unfortunately, the Hamlin Park Community Association has gotten in bed with Canisius College on certain things, and they've been able to be manipulated by Canisius College, But Hamlin Park Taxpayers Association was a vital part of keeping that neighborhood strong, and still is, really. Mm-hmm.
Right. We understand that even though they couldn't stop the expressway, they were instrumental in stopping the overhead rail. Do you remember that movement, and how did you see the neighbors coming together?
Well, Hamlin Park Association wasn't formed until after the expressway was built. So to understand that, it really came out of Charles Perkins and his activities that led to the formation of the Hamlin Park Community Association. And there's another lady who was involved in there, Claude somebody, I think, not sure what her last name was. Claudia Sims.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but today we honor Reva Bethel as one of the elder members.
Yeah, I don't remember meeting her at all.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You know Stephanie Jeter.
I know she changed her name to Stephanie Barber.
She did, Stephanie Barber Jeter.
I see. All right.
Mm-hmm. Right. So they meet faithfully every month, at School 74, and they talk about, the absentee landlords and the students. They in fact call some landlords to the meeting and, sort of chew them out about the way that they're letting their properties go down.
Well, I have a...
Fight them because often they just sell to another absentee landlord. When they get in a certain amount of trouble with housing court, they sell.
Well, I have mixed feelings about the Hamley Park neighborhood and where it's going, because what I see is that the community is being re-energized and revitalized as essentially whites are moving in to a predominantly black area, which essentially is losing its vitality. And the blacks in the area are trying to escape and are offered substantial value for their properties, which makes it easy for them to leave and so forth. So in one instance, you have essentially a young black community moving into an area which housed a older black community, and the two of them are clashing together, really. Yeah.
We wish that they could collaborate more.
Yes, that's right.
In a feeling of inclusion, and to resegregate or to try to integrate the neighborhood, you would think that's a good thing.
Yes, right.
Now, you don't want gentrification to take over and push out all of the original residents, but it seems that some amount of integration could be good.
Well, there's a whole thing about white flight.
Yes.
Yeah, and this is almost the reverse of that, when essentially white people are moving into a predominantly black neighborhood. But the big magnet, of course, is Canisius College.
That's right.
Yeah, if it weren't for Canisius College, nothing like that would happen, really.
That's true.
And
That's
so
true. Community anchors are critical. And then to just across Jefferson, the new Archive Center right at the edge of the cemetery there, there's a big new building where people can research their genealogy of the people who are buried in Forest Lawn Park. That's a new.
Where is that building? Is it?
It's right across from the Canisius Montante Center.
I see, I see. There's a new building that Canisius has built?
No, not Canisius. I think it was funded by the Went Foundation.
I see.
But it's part of the upkeep of Forest Lawn.
I see, all right.
It's
I don't,
named after Margaret Went.
I see, right. Well, the other source of money besides governmental agencies are private foundations, and there are a lot of private foundations that are here. And you've got another one is the Ralph Wilson Foundation, which is a newly created foundation that could produce a lot of resources for you.
And we do intend to approach the Community Foundation. Went has donated some amount to Restore Our Community Coalition. But there's also Oshai Community Foundation, and then the, to some degree, the Baird Foundation.
I see.
They seem to be very much interested in preservation.
But what would you be approaching them for?
We would be approaching them for funding to help us continue to educate the community, to staff our organization so that we can continue to advocate for the restoration of the parkway. But it takes lawn signs, we have bookmarks, we have all kinds of handouts, and so just the operations of being an advocacy organization.
I see.
I think you would like what we're about, especially because you were into community advocacy and architecture.
Yes.
And maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, even give us some tips. But our organization is about, we have 10 members on the steering committee, and we're a coalition actually, because Olmsted Parks would like to see Humboldt Parkway restored. The Science Museum certainly would like to see back to the original steps and greenery leading into that area, beautifying the MLK Park. And we also have the Black Chamber of Commerce, one of our coalition members. We're also working now on the Partnership for the Public Good. So that group out of Cornell University, and they're down on Main Street, but they've just recently moved to the Market Arcade. But they tend to do a lot of white papers, policy papers. They did something about the adverse effects of traffic and transportation and its effect on neighborhoods. So they are studying some of the same issues that we talk about that need to be addressed and that would be ameliorated to some degree if we were able to cover the Humboldt, cover the 33.
Has anybody done a realistic cost estimate in terms of what it would cost to cover the expressway?
Well, there's currently 5 alternatives that were presented by the Department of Transportation in 2012, and the alternative that we're advocating for is Alternative D, which is estimated to be about $570 million.
That's what I thought. So this is $500 million.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
And Dave Stieglitz says it'll be $1 billion by the time it's done.
Yeah, I mean,
especially if you try to go all the way back to Main Street.
Right. Yeah.
So we realize it's an expensive venture, but also we think about the great expense that it took away from this neighborhood in terms of the housing values that were lost, the illnesses that have occurred, the respiratory illnesses because of the residents being too close to the fumes on the parkway.
Well, the problem with the philosophy of covering the expressway is that in covering the expressway now will probably do damage to the neighborhoods that are adjacent to it in a way that they cannot essentially recover. And so when you talk about $500 million, think about the damage to the neighborhoods that are going to be affected by that.
And what damage? We're interested to hear your
in terms
ideas.
of housing values, existing housing, which has recovered. Much of that housing along Humboldt has already recovered from the expressway. The crucial thing in terms of the expressway was it cut off the neighborhood streets from each other, you know. And so, like, the Trinidad neighborhood is completely isolated now and so forth. But in trying to restore the expressway, I feel that you'll be doing greater damage than you might really sort of expect from a project like this.
We are hoping not. In fact, we had a study by the UB Regional Institute, and there they looked at models, neighborhood development models along the lines of the facts that housing values improve where there's more green space, and that neighborhoods along parkways generally have higher values than those that are not. And so in that respect, actually the economic impact study that we have says that the housing value would increase, and from that, the city taxes, of course, will increase. So it would be a benefit to the economy and create over 900 construction jobs.
I see.
Of almost $1 billion in output to the economy. So if you spend $500 million, but you're going to get $1 billion in output in terms of mainly the construction jobs, but also the increased value of the houses, then we feel like not we feel, but the UP study has indicated that it would be a positive return on the economy. But I'm very interested to hear that you thought it would go the other way.
I still do. So I wish you good luck as you try that out. Part of my life was spent in Minneapolis, and Minneapolis has expressways that are crisscrossing the city in residential areas that were prime residential areas and so forth. In Minneapolis, the method of keeping the noise and other intrusions out was to build these big fences along the residential neighborhoods, you know, to the extent that you don't see the expressway, and you might not hear it either, really, you know. But I don't know if that was a positive thing or a negative thing, really. And so.
Now that must have been quite a transition. I read that you started at Hampton and you finished at Minneapolis. Talk about that.
No, I finished at MIT in Cambridge.
Right, with your master's. But was your bachelor's in architecture from?
Bachelor's of Architecture from the University of Minnesota.
University of Minnesota.
And also before that, a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Minnesota. So,
and did you, I think I read that your parents attended Hampton.
They did attend Hampton.
And you did for some time?
I spent 2 years at Hampton, from 47 to 49.
So to go from the historically black college to Minneapolis, which has to be very, maybe not as integrated, what kind of transition was that for you?
It wasn't much of a transition because I had gone to Tech High School in Buffalo for 4 years, and I was the only student out of my class of 33 in building design, and I graduated a third in my class and all. So I had come from an integrated environment, and my elementary school was also integrated, School 8, because we grew up in a German American neighborhood. In fact, right down the street from Jefferson and Utica is where my house was. And so the transition, the more interesting transition was from Tech High School to Hampton Institute. And I went there because I was not sure what my academic pursuit should be, and I picked building design, and I entered into building design. But I found that the educational vigor was not there at Hampton Institute that I needed. And I decided after 2 years that I would transfer to the University of Minnesota. Now, going to Minnesota, I was one of maybe 100 African-American students in a school of 35,000 students and so forth. And so in that campus, there were students who had never seen a black person before.
Oh my.
And when you walk down the street and so forth, did you? It was.
Very much a curiosity.
That's right, and so but Minnesota gave me a good education, and that helped me get to the University MIT.
No doubt. Now, I want to switch just for a minute to our Michigan Street work. Did you happen to know a gentleman named Everett Fly? He's the a landscape architect out of, I want to say Arlington, Texas. And he was on a consulting team that assisted us with the management plan for Michigan Avenue and the African American Heritage Corridor.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just thinking that, looking at your age and his age, he was at Harvard School of Architecture, and it might have been around the same time that you were at MIT. I don't know if you came across him. He was the first African American graduate from the architecture school at Harvard.
I see. People tell me, and I don't know it for sure, but I was said that I had the second master's degree from MIT that had been offered. Mm-hmm. Right. When I was in Minnesota, out of 250 students at Minnesota, I was the only African American who was there. Mm-hmm. While at the University of Minnesota, there were maybe 100 black students. I was the only. No, not the only black student, but I was one out of 100 black students on campus, really. And so, even though the campus was in a very crucial situation, in that Hubert Humphrey was the mayor of Minneapolis, Whitney Young was head of the Urban League in St. Paul, Minnesota. So they had both gone to school at Minnesota. So it had a number of prominent African Americans who had gone to school there. Carl Stokes, the writer, went to school there, and right.
So maybe it was more welcoming than
it was a welcoming environment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
Interesting.
I mean, I met my wife there at Minnesota, really, and I would never have met her if it weren't for the integrated situation which existed in Minnesota at the time.
Beautiful.
And we've been married for 66 years now, really.
Amazing.
Or is it 62? I get that big figure wrong. We got married in 1954.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Wow. And your children, where are they now?
They're in San Francisco. They both live in San Francisco, but about 100 miles apart. And my son is a transportation planner, and my daughter is an artist,
So they each picked up part of your skill, because of course architects are.
Yeah, I think so, because
my
my son is a transportation planner, and so he works with transportation systems and funding them and so forth.
Excellent. How often do they get to come home?
I don't know. Maybe it was because of me. I spurred them on.
I should think so.
But I came home because my parents were in their late 60s, and there was nobody else to take care of them at all. And so I came home, and I don't regret coming home because it gave me a good foundation here. And so, but what happens is that children normally sort of go to school. They go through their elementary school and high school, and they go off to college, and then they may or they may not come back, really.
That's what they call the brain drain.
Yeah, that's right, the brain drain, yeah.
So just to give a brief background information about the Kensington Expressway, when it was first approved, it had city, state, and federal funding, which at the time amounted to $45 million. But today, when adjusted for inflation, that would total up to over $400 million.
I see.
So when we're asking for a price such as $570 million, wouldn't you interpret that as us bringing back some of that money that was lost when the expressway was originally built?
Well, you're saying that the original cost of the expressway was, in today's dollars, would be almost $500 million, is that right?
Right.
Right, and then the question is what to do with returning some of that money to the community itself?
Yes. We understand that the cost for restoring the expressway is a legitimate concern, but we do believe that finding a long-term solution is more plausible than leaving it as it is. if Buffalo is currently redeveloping itself, then we want to make sure that every neighborhood is included in the narrative. If we leave the Kensington Expressway as it is, then the east side is highly at risk of being left out of the current redevelopment narrative.
I'm not sure that I agree that there would be a tremendous economic benefit to the east side if the expressway is eliminated. I'm not completely sure of that. You would have to convince me that that would happen. You have some vital streets on the east side that might benefit. Ferry Street might become a major crosstown street, just as Delvin is a major crosstown street, just as Utica could become a major crosstown street. Those the major streets might essentially benefit from economic development, and because right now there's this move on to connect the east side of Ferry Street with the west side of Ferry Street, and they're talking about the development at Ferry and Main Street and so forth. Well, one would hope that maybe you could take the Elmwood Village and turn it 90 degrees and all, and not let it go down Elmwood Avenue, but turn it so it goes up Ferry Street and East Utica Street, so that they become vital parts of the community.
Well, that's sort of what Mr. Mark Goldman is doing with his program. I believe it's called the Ferry Street Corridor Project. And they had a major event a year and a half ago where everyone held hands across the axis of West and East Ferry Streets. And this was part of an effort to raise awareness of the economic imbalance in different neighborhoods across the city.
Well, that might work, except that Main Street has been the wall. I mean, in the sense that Main Street has literally cut the city in half and all. There's the thriving west side of Main Street, which doesn't look anything like the depressed east side of Main Street. In fact, you would not know if that you were on the west side of Buffalo because of the tremendous amount of development that's there and so forth, as opposed to the development that doesn't exist on the east side. So something needs to be done, and I think maybe they ought to spend the $500 million on development of those streets and all, and leave the Kensington Expressway as it is.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
More housing,
Yeah.
infill housing,
Right.
better stock.
Maybe.
I think we have to be open to the possibilities.
Yes. Well, you keep thinking about where all this money's going to come from, and I just don't know.
Yeah, your point is well taken.
It's hard to unmake a situation that has already been made. Right.
So we look at so many beautiful photographs of what Buffalo's east side once was, and we're asking any residents to share any photographs that they may have of what Humboldt Parkway was once like. Do you have any photos that you may own of what Humboldt used to look like?
I don't have any. I only have photos of my existing house.
None of your kids playing in the median. That would be a good one.
Yeah. No, I don't have any of those. I was one of those that chased them off of the median.
Okay. You wanted to preserve the grass. Well, tell us a little bit about, as an architect and Olmsted's vision, how important do you think it was to connect the parks with the parkway system?
Well, they are integral parts of each other, the parks as well as the parkway system. The parkway system was a linkage that essentially connected the various entities along the way. Humboldt Parkway would be Humboldt, the original Humboldt that was a rotunda and so forth. And I think they were very important, really. In fact, there's an arc around Buffalo which exists today that connects the Parkway system, really. And so you go from Humboldt Park to the Delaware Park. You go over to the North Buffalo, and all the way around the city, and finally ending up at South Buffalo, really, with South Park.
It was an incredible vision. And the only parkway, as you know, that was destroyed was Humboldt. And it's the only Olmsted designed park system in America that was destroyed.
Yes.
And so in terms of preserving the history, and while it may not be an economically an easy thing to do, we also look at it as a historic preservation measure to restore that parkway system.
And we know that you've been doing your part.
You know that
we're not selling you on it. You're looking at it. How we sold you that.
I am not a believer in spending $500 million to restore the expressway, because I think that in restoring it, you'll probably end up doing more damage than you think, really. I mean, it's not going to be an easy sell to restore that expressway. And the houses next to the expressway are going to suffer as well. I mean, you talk about the trees that were cut down to make the expressway. That's what happened in showing my neighbors what would happen. They weren't interested until they cut the trees down next to in the block next door to them. Well, since then, those that are remaining have grown, become major trees. And some of those major trees would have to come down. And probably some of the housing will have to come down too, in order to essentially restore Humboldt Parkway. So
that's what we want to at least study and look at. What would it take to do that? We need more data on that.
Well, you have already the construction estimate, and then you have the UB study that tells you what it would cost and so forth. Why don't you just put them together and all, and you know it's a $1 billion project. It's a $1 billion project.
It's huge. It's huge.
Yeah.
I want to say, was it Labella? Who did the engineering study, Brad? Do you remember? With the 5 design alternatives for the DOT. We were talking to them out of Rochester.
The one image that I saw that was produced by the DOT was from CSS Services.
CSS.
They do have an office downtown. I believe with Labella, they're doing a study on the Skagit Expressway.
Oh, okay.
If you want to look at a restoration effort, take a look out the window. I mean, this is the fruit belt.
Yes.
It's being swallowed up by the medical corridor and so forth. I mean, they got more buildings around here than you can think of. They're talking about a walkway connecting the buildings. All you have to do is run a plank across, and you could run into the roofs of all those buildings and so forth.
Like Minneapolis. Downtown Minneapolis is connected.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, right. Well, the whole city of Minneapolis is connected almost. But look at what's left over. I mean, that house is all going to go. Take your pictures right now, because it's not going to be there.
Wow.
And it's a shame. And unfortunately, that the churches are very much in pocket with the developers here, really, and all. And so you got St. John's Church, you got Traynham and their development, which is going on there. And Langston Hughes Center is taken over by Seminelli, I think it was. And so this is a shame as to what's going on right here in terms of the neighborhood going through a complete restoration is difficult. It's a negative restoration, not a positive one.
We're going to have our eyes on that as far as the Michigan Street corridor. And what we would like to see is, especially in the Broadway and Michigan area, is more retail, some restaurants, things that would make it interesting to be in the corridor and to see the museums such as the Nash Museum or the Color Musicians Club Museum. So we're hoping that part of the fruit belt can hang on because it is, an important part of the history of Buffalo. And, you're right, we're right here on Michigan Avenue, and the corridor actually spans from, you want to say, First Shiloh up to Bethel AME. So we would like to see all of this preserved and some sort of cooperation between the medical campus and the neighborhood, which, like you say, they're at heads right now because of the parking situation, they're taking over the houses, and so it's going to be a story yet to be told. It's not all done yet.
Yeah, I think you're overly optimistic in terms of looking at Michigan Avenue from Shiloh. Would it be Shiloh Church? That's at Eagle Street, isn't it, almost?
Right.
Yeah,
and the reason we picked that was because of the William Wells Brown marker, so it's a historic site. And then from there you come over to Michigan and Durham.
But then you could go all the way up to Bethel Church,
Right.
That's at Ferry Street, isn't it?
Yes.
Well,
The historic sites along the way.
I
So
see.
If you did a church tour, you're going to pass Pilgrim, you're going to pass the Michigan Avenue Baptist Church and come on up. But it's something that we felt you needed more than just one intersection to really attract tourists. You got to talk about the whole story. And one thing that was surfaced was that Jackie Robinson and other baseball greats were emerging from their careers in the Negro Leagues to the major leagues and played at the baseball stadium on the site where Buffalo Academy of Performing
which is
Arts
Offerman
was.
Stadium. Offerman
Stadium,
Stadium.
yes, yes. So that's actually a piece of African American history too. So just trying to pick that up, and then the fact that, Ferry goes all the way down to the river, and you look at Broderick Park and its part in African American history, and then the fugitives getting to Canada
I
to
see.
seek freedom.
Your thrust is very honorary, and honorable,
Thank you.
but it's also very ambitious.
This is true.
Yeah,
Think big.
it's very ambitious, and I think you ought to grab hold of something that's small enough for you to handle. And I think that the Kensington Expressway maybe is doable, but it's going to take some work. It's going to take some work. If they can invest $1 billion in a solar heating plant out there in Batavia or somewhere, they ought to be able to invest the same amount of money here in Buffalo.
Exactly.
We love it. We love it. Well, we want to thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for coming.
We really appreciate it. Your mind is sharp.
Well, I don't know if it's sharp or not, but it's there.
It is.
Yeah,
It
right.
is. It is.